The caretaker arrived at the cemetery just as he had every night for the past year. The gates creaked softly as he pushed through, the sound swallowed by the empty expanse of gravestones that stretched into darkness. The air was cold, dry, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Normally, the wind whispered between the trees, a familiar lullaby that marked the rhythm of his rounds. Tonight, it felt sharper, deliberate, cutting across the rows of stones in uneven bursts. He walked slowly, boots crunching against gravel, scanning the familiar names etched in weathered marble. Shadows stretched unnaturally under the pale moonlight, elongating and bending along paths he had walked hundreds of times. One stone in particular caught his attention, a simple marker at the edge of the oldest section. It seemed off. The engraving looked fresher than it should, edges sharp in a way that made him pause. A small shift, barely perceptible, as if the stone had moved just an inch while he looked away. He shook his head, blaming fatigue, the monotony of late-night rounds playing tricks on him. But the feeling lingered, a subtle prickling at the back of his neck. Every familiar landmark seemed slightly skewed, angles misaligned, shadows stretching a moment too long. The cemetery was the same as always, yet something about it felt different, as though it were waiting, breathing quietly beneath the still night. And he couldn't shake the sense that it was watching him back. The first whispers arrived just as he reached the far side of the cemetery, past the older section where gravestones leaned against each other like tired travelers. At first, he thought it was the wind again, threading through the gaps between the stones, rustling leaves and small branches. But the sound was different, softer, deliberate, curling around the edges of his awareness. He stopped, listening. A faint murmur slipped through the shadows, almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the night. His boots made uneven crunches on gravel, each step echoing oddly, stretched as if the cemetery itself had widened. He called out quietly, "Hello?" The sound swallowed by the darkness. The whispers didn't answer, yet they seemed to grow louder, circling him in soft, incomprehensible words. He turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning the rows of graves, lantern light catching polished surfaces and rough, moss-covered stones. Nothing moved, no one was there, and yet the sound persisted, curling in and around him, always just beyond the edge of understanding. A name drifted out of the shadows. At first, he didn't recognize it, but then it hit him. His name, spoken softly, almost tenderly, carried on a breath of air that had no source. His pulse quickened, muscles tightening, and he began walking faster, the whispers now repeating fragments of his life. The small victories, the little regrets, details no one else could know. Every step he took seemed to echo the words back at him, the voices overlapping and layering until he could no longer tell which was real and which was imagined. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was fatigue, imagination, the monotony of night shifts playing cruel tricks. Yet the cemetery had changed. The rows of gravestones seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, forming new angles, new gaps, as if creating pathways he had never walked before. One tombstone in particular caught his eye, a simple marker at the far end that hadn't been there yesterday, or so he thought. He blinked, and it wavered, the shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground, like a hand reaching for him. His steps slowed. Each movement became deliberate, cautious, as the whispers grew bolder, forming words he could almost comprehend. Sentences began to take shape, murmured accusations, names of people he had met long ago, details he hadn't thought about in years. He paused, breath catching in his throat, fogging the collar of his coat in the icy night air. There was a rhythm to the sounds now, a cadence that matched his heartbeat, rising and falling, circling him as if the very ground beneath him were alive. He felt it then, a presence brushing at the edge of his senses, lingering just beyond his lantern's glow. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the darkness between the tombstones, and for a fraction of a second he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting from one marker to another, disappearing whenever he tried to focus. The whispers grew louder, layering atop one another in a chorus of barely formed language, repeating phrases that chilled him. Phrases that sounded like secrets he hadn't spoken aloud, but that someone, or something, had heard. Panic began to coil in his stomach. The familiar pathways were unfamiliar now, the stones rearranging themselves subtly, guiding him deeper into the cemetery. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to leave, but the rows of graves seemed to stretch endlessly behind him, paths folding into themselves. He was not alone, though no one was visible. The night itself felt like a living entity, breathing, moving, watching, keeping him under its quiet, patient gaze. As he continued down a narrow path between two particularly tall tombs, the whispers grew insistent. His name again called softly, over and over, now punctuated by fragments of sentences he could almost understand. They were beckoning him forward, drawing him into the heart of the cemetery, the air thickening with cold mist that rose from the earth. The trees around him rustled despite the wind dying, and the shadows deepened, pooling around the stones like ink. Somewhere in the distance, a low, almost inaudible creak echoed, a branch bending, or something heavier moving through the dark. And as he stepped forward, he realized he could no longer tell if the whispers were behind him, ahead of him, or inside his own head. The cemetery had grown silent in the spaces between voices, a silence that pressed against him, heavy and deliberate, holding him in place. He was no longer just walking among the graves. He was moving through something aware, something that had been waiting, and it was patient. The fog rolled in thicker that night, settling over the gravestones in a damp, cold blanket that clung to his coat and seeped into his boots. The caretaker had walked these rows countless times, yet tonight the paths felt unfamiliar, winding and uneven in ways that shouldn't exist. Each step seemed to echo longer than it should, bouncing off stones that appeared farther apart than they had minutes ago. He squinted through the mist, trying to orient himself, but the familiar landmarks, the leaning oak, the cracked statue near the cemetery entrance, seemed to shift ever so slightly whenever he glanced away. Then the whispers returned, stronger, sharper, more precise. No longer distant, they traced him from every direction, weaving together sentences that chilled him to the core. They recited fragments of his life he hadn't shared with the soul. Childhood memories, petty mistakes, names of people he hadn't spoken to in years. Every word pressed on him, heavy and tangible, leaving a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to shake it off, muttering aloud, questioning his own sanity, but the fog swallowed his voice almost immediately, returning only the murmurs, now layered like a chorus of unseen mouths. He reached for a headstone at the edge of the oldest section, intending to steady himself, and froze. The engraving, which he had passed countless times, now appeared to shimmer in the dim light. When he blinked, it seemed to stretch vertically, elongating unnaturally. He took a cautious step back, but the fog swirled around his boots, tugging at him, curling like fingers. His heart raced, the rhythm of his pulse matching the cadence of the whispers. Every step he tried to retrace became uncertain. Paths he knew by memory bent and shifted, diverting him deeper into the cemetery's maze. Something brushed against the back of his neck, barely there, a whisper of movement, a draft, or perhaps the presence itself. He spun, lantern swinging wildly, illuminating only the nearest stones. Shadows clung unnaturally to the edges of the fog, folding and stretching across surfaces that should have been flat. The gravestones seemed to pulse in rhythm with the murmurs, forming subtle patterns he couldn't yet read. Rectangular lines and angles repeated across the ground, as though the cemetery were arranging itself like a code meant for him alone. He stumbled forward, drawn by a mixture of dread and curiosity. The whispers now repeated specific events, conversations from earlier that day, things he hadn't intended to share. It was impossible. No one could have known. The cemetery had become a recorder of his life, a living archive of everything he thought private. He looked around desperately, scanning each row, each upright stone, and, for a brief moment, he thought he saw letters appear, etched into marble with no hand guiding them. Panic began to coil tightly around his chest. Every attempt to leave was thwarted. The paths he had known for years now ended abruptly in blank fog or curved impossibly back upon themselves. He felt the ground underfoot shift subtly, the gravel crunching differently, as though reshaping itself in real time. Each gravestone he passed seemed to turn its face slightly toward him when he wasn't looking, aligning silently in a manner he could not comprehend. The air thickened, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and something more metallic. Blood or rust, he couldn't tell. A low hum began to vibrate through the cemetery, blending with the whispers. It resonated in his chest, syncing with his heartbeat. He tried to focus on the lantern, its glow pale and trembling, but the fog refracted it, creating the illusion of dozens of lights scattered across the cemetery. Each flickering point seemed to move independently, circling him, drawing him forward. And then he realized the whispers weren't just reciting memories. They were giving instructions, subtle, insistent nudges, guiding him toward the center of the grounds. Every instinct screamed to resist, to run, but the paths now twisted impossibly. The caretaker stumbled into another row of old stones, one he didn't recognize, though he was sure he had passed it before. Names he didn't know were etched across their surfaces, yet the voices called them out as though he should understand. The air became heavier, each breath thick with fog and unseen presence. The cemetery had stopped being a place of rest. It had become something sentient, aware of him, aware of every step, every thought, every memory. He tried to turn back again, but the fog and shadows moved like liquid, blocking his exit. His lantern trembled in his hand, illuminating only fragments of the world around him, revealing stones that had shifted just enough to confuse him completely. The whispers converged into a cacophony, overlapping his own thoughts, pressing against the edges of his mind. Somewhere deep inside, he understood that the cemetery had no intention of letting him leave. Not yet, not ever. And in the swirling fog, between the shifting gravestones, he felt it. He was being drawn forward into secrets he had never asked to know, into the heart of a darkness that belonged only to the living and the dead together. The caretaker stopped, squinting through the thickening fog, trying to make sense of the rows before him. At first, they seemed ordinary, stone after stone, names carved and worn by years. But as he stepped forward, he noticed subtle repetitions, alignments too precise to be natural. One row mirrored another perfectly, the same spacing, the same angles, and the stones seemed to form lines, like arrows or letters, patterns he couldn't read but felt compelled to follow. Every instinct told him to turn back, but the whispers tugged at the edges of his awareness, coaxing him deeper. The chorus had returned, louder now, layered with overlapping voices that rose and fell like waves. They repeated phrases, fragments of sentences he couldn't fully understand. Yet he knew they were meant for him. The words scraped at memory, dredging up half-remembered regrets and secrets he hadn't dared think of in years. With each step, the fog thickened, curling around his boots, clinging to the soles, tugging him forward into corridors of stones that seemed to shift when he looked away. Paths he had always trusted bent unnaturally, doubling back, creating loops that disoriented him completely. He tried to shake the feeling that the cemetery was moving beneath him, but the ground remained stubbornly still. It was the stones themselves, their arrangement, the way shadows pooled between them, the way their surfaces caught the faint light, that made the patterns alive. He noticed repetitions in the inscriptions, dates, initials, symbols, etched over and over across different graves. Some markings were familiar, names of people he had known, others unknown, yet the whispers called them all aloud with the same insistence, as though each stone was a voice demanding recognition. The caretaker's lantern swung in a wide arc, catching shapes that weren't there moments before. He glimpsed angles that defied physics, paths curving into each other impossibly, stone edges forming geometric alignments like a code meant for no one else but him. The whispers intensified, overlapping in a rhythm that made his head spin. They spoke faster now, phrases fragmenting into syllables he could barely process, circling him like a flock of birds trapped in a cage. He stumbled, gripping the lantern tighter, trying to force the pattern into comprehension, but it twisted and warped whenever he tried to focus. From the corner of his eye, he saw a line of gravestones that appeared to stretch away into infinity, yet a blink later, they were only a dozen yards from him. He spun, trying to retrace his steps, but every row repeated itself differently, creating a labyrinth of stones that shifted subtly, mocking his memory. The whispers now punctuated themselves with hisses, faint metallic clangs that echoed through the fog. The sound made his stomach churn, a visceral warning that the cemetery was no longer passive. It was aware. He paused at what should have been a familiar clearing, expecting the open space that marked the old family plots. Instead, the stones formed concentric circles, enclosing him. The whispers swelled into a chorus, rising in pitch and urgency, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to distinguish words from thought. They seemed to pull him toward the center, toward a place he did not recognize, yet he felt certain he had walked there before. Or, perhaps, he had only imagined it. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the fog and the stones conspired to keep him moving deeper. The caretaker's breaths came faster now, fogging the collar of his coat, each inhale thick with the metallic scent of earth and decay. He could feel the weight of the cemetery pressing against him from all sides, stones tilting ever so slightly as if leaning in to watch, listen, judge. The patterns weren't just shapes, they were commands, subtle nudges dictating every step, every movement, each aligned to the rhythm of the whispers that knew him better than he knew himself. As he reached the center of the circle, the voices fell into a low, humming resonance. The fog thickened into near impenetrable white, curling around the gravestones like smoke from a fire that had never burned. Shapes of figures flitted at the edges of his vision, human-like but impossibly thin, lingering, watching him. The caretaker realized he was no longer moving through a cemetery but through a labyrinth designed around him, a place that bent to the will of something he could not name. He swallowed hard, heart pounding, realizing that the cemetery's boundaries were no longer fixed. Each stone, each path, each shadow could shift at any moment. The whispers crescendoed once more, beckoning him forward, closer to a heart of secrets he had never asked to see. And somewhere deep in the fog, he understood the truth. The cemetery was alive, and it had been waiting for him to notice the patterns all along. He reached the center of the cemetery, or what he thought was the center, where the rows of gravestones bent into impossible angles. The fog clung to the ground in heavy layers, swirling around his boots like it had a life of its own. That's when he saw it. Freshly turned earth, darker and damp, the edges sharp as though cut just hours ago. The caretaker froze, lantern trembling in his hand, the pale light illuminating a single stone that reflected the moon with an unnatural gleam. His name was carved across it, crisp, precise, undeniable. His breath caught. Every instinct screamed to step back, to flee, but the fog pressed in from all sides, cold and dense, tugging at his sleeves, curling around him like smoke. The whispers surged, a chorus now, overlapping, layering voices in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Names, dates, fragments of conversations, he had not spoken these aloud, not to anyone, flooded the air. They pressed on him, crawling under his skin, making him acutely aware of every misstep, every hidden regret. He stepped closer, almost compelled, as if drawn by a force he could neither see nor resist. The soil of the grave seemed almost to shift beneath his feet. Subtle movements, almost imperceptible, as if it were breathing. The stone at its head was flawless, smooth, impossibly new compared to the weathered markers surrounding it. It bore no symbol, no epitaph, just his name. The whispers were now insistent, demanding acknowledgement, their tone heavy with authority, a pressing weight that left no room for denial. The caretaker's hands shook, lantern swaying, casting the stone in fragmented shadows. The fog thickened, curling around him and obscuring the rest of the cemetery. He tried to step back, to retrace his path through the shifting gravestones, but every familiar row had become unfamiliar. Paths twisted, looping, leading him forward even as he attempted to retreat. The whispers spoke faster now, overlapping syllables forming a language he almost recognized, a cadence that tugged at the edges of his mind. He felt the ground underfoot change subtly, gravel crunching differently, soft soil giving slightly beneath him, as though the earth itself were alive and aware. A low hum reverberated through the fog, vibrating up through his boots into his chest, a resonance that made his teeth chatter and pulse in his temples. Shapes flickered at the edges of his lantern's light, human-like forms he could not focus on, vanishing the moment he tried. The whispers coalesced into a chorus of accusation and recognition, pressing against every thought, every memory. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was not just a cemetery, it was a trap. The ground, the stones, the fog, even the whispers, were focused entirely on him. Every instinct told him to run, yet the paths refused to lead him out. The fog thickened, pulling him closer to the grave, guiding him as though invisible hands shaped the earth beneath his boots. He leaned toward it, almost in a trance, the moonlight illuminating the smooth surface of the stone, reflecting his pallid face back at him. The whispers crescendoed, layering secrets he had never admitted aloud. They mocked him, pressing all that he had hidden, all he had feared, into his mind at once. A breeze, or perhaps a presence, passed, and the soil at the edge of the grave shifted again. The caretaker staggered, lantern clattering to the ground, and he saw it. Faint footprints leading into the grave itself, small depressions that had not been there before. The whispers surged into a deafening chorus, repeating his name in a rhythm that matched his frantic heartbeat. He tried to step backward, tried to leave, but the gravestones, the fog, the night itself seemed to close around him, guiding him inexorably toward the center. He knew then, as surely as he had known the names the whispers had spoken, that the cemetery had singled him out. This was no longer a place of rest, no longer a quiet repository of the dead. It was a living entity, focused on him, feeding on his fear, shaping reality to ensure he could not leave. And in the heart of it, the freshly dug grave bore witness to its intent, carved with his name, waiting. The caretaker's hands reached for the soil, trembling, fog curling around him. The whispers now a relentless, insistent chorus. Every rational thought faltered. The air was thick with the metallic scent of earth and something unplaceable, heavy and wrong. He realized, with a cold certainty, that the cemetery was no longer just around him. It was inside him, inescapable, patient, and watching. And in that moment, standing before the freshly dug grave, he understood. He was not the caretaker here tonight. He was the visitor. The fog thickened, rolling in dense curtains that clung to his legs, seeping up through the soles of his boots. Every step became a struggle, each movement sluggish, as though the air itself had weight. The cemetery had changed entirely. Paths he had once known, straight, predictable, familiar, twisted endlessly, looping back on themselves, walls of mist and shadow pressing closer with every step. The whispers had multiplied, forming a chorus so layered that he could no longer distinguish one voice from another. They called his name relentlessly, over and over, a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. The whispers no longer offered fragments of memory. Now they demanded attention, confessions, recognition. Every secret he had kept, every hidden thought, every fleeting guilt was echoed back at him in tones that scraped at his skull and settled like cold metal against his spine. He tried to focus, to find a single path out, but the fog reshaped itself around his lantern, each flicker of light revealing new corridors of gravestones where none had existed moments before. The caretaker stumbled, trying to backtrack, only to find his own steps echoed by soft, deliberate footfalls that did not match his pace. He spun in a circle, eyes straining through the mist, but nothing appeared, nothing visible, and yet the sensation of being followed, guided, observed was overwhelming. Shapes flickered at the periphery of his vision, shadows that bent and shifted, almost human but impossibly tall, impossibly thin. They seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the whispers, moving in time with the voices that now pressed into his ears, vibrating through his skull. Every instinct screamed to run, yet no exit remained. Each turn, each attempt to retrace his steps, collapsed into another corridor of fog and stone. The gravestones themselves had taken on a new presence, leaning slightly, edges sharp, faces reflecting pale moonlight that had no source. Some inscriptions had changed, names unfamiliar, dates impossibly recent. Yet the whispers spoke them aloud as if he should know them. He could feel the cemetery's awareness in every inch of the ground, in every breath of the fog, in every subtle movement of the stones. The chorus of voices rose, overlapping in layers, forming a rhythm that no human could match. They spoke in cadence with the rapid beating of his heart, repeating phrases he couldn't understand but felt compelled to obey. The fog swirled around him, curling at his feet, climbing his legs, wrapping around his arms, blurring the line between solid ground and nothingness. The whispers coalesced, louder now, forming sentences that seemed to seep into his own thoughts. Confess, follow, stay, they murmured, each syllable a weight pressing into his mind. He tried to lift his lantern, casting light in all directions, but the fog refracted it, creating dozens of points of illumination that shifted and moved, circling him endlessly. The ground beneath him became uneven, subtle rises and dips that tugged at his balance, confusing his sense of distance and direction. Every familiar marker, every headstone he recognized, had shifted. He was no longer navigating a cemetery. He was navigating a labyrinth that bent reality itself, guided by the voices that now commanded him utterly. A sudden clatter echoed through the fog, a gravestone tipping, a branch snapping, or something heavier moving unseen, and the whispers surged, overlapping, crescendoing into a cacophony that pressed into his ears and chest. He staggered forward, driven by a mixture of fear and instinct, yet every step drew him deeper into the heart of the cemetery. The fog thickened around his shoulders, forming walls he could not penetrate, funneling him toward a place he could neither see nor comprehend. Every rational thought slipped away. His name repeated, first softly, then sharply, then in overlapping layers that made his mind reel. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that the cemetery itself had become a trap, a sentient entity that reshaped itself to contain him. The fog, the stones, the whispers, all were focused entirely on him, patient and unyielding. Every escape route he could imagine dissolved into nothingness, leaving him suspended between the material world and something far older, far colder. The caretaker's breaths came in ragged gasps, fog curling from his mouth in icy spirals. He was alone, and yet not alone. The voices pressed into him, demanding, guiding, consuming. There was no way out, not in any direction he could see or imagine. The night stretched endlessly, unbroken, as the chorus of whispers surged around him, and he understood fully for the first time that the cemetery was alive, and he was now a permanent participant in its endless, patient rituals. The first hints of dawn should have crept over the horizon, pale and soft, yet the cemetery remained steeped in an unyielding darkness. Fog clung stubbornly to every gravestone, curling in dense swirls around his boots, refusing to lift no matter how long he stood in one place. The caretaker's lantern flickered weakly, its light swallowed instantly by the heavy air. Every step he tried to take toward what he hoped was an exit dissolved into more labyrinthine paths, the stones forming walls that bent reality in impossible ways. The whispers had grown deafening, a relentless chorus that vibrated in his chest, threading through his skull, repeating every secret, every regret, every unspoken thought he had ever carried. He stumbled forward, dragging his feet through the wet earth, only to find paths folding back on themselves. Gravestones leaned in ways that defied logic, some floating just above the ground before settling again. The fog clung to him like a living thing, crawling up his legs and twisting around his arms, restricting his movements. He could hear countless voices overlapping in a maddening harmony, but none offered guidance, none spoke words he could act upon. Panic wrapped tighter around him, a suffocating weight that pressed into his chest. He called out, hoping that shouting might break the spell of the whispers, but his voice returned to him warped and slowed, distorted by the fog, echoing in ways that didn't match the cemetery he knew. Somewhere in the dense white, he glimpsed shadows flickering at the edges of perception. Figures too tall, too thin, their movements deliberate and inhuman. They did not approach, yet their presence was undeniable, circling him, waiting, patient. He tried to run, but the earth refused. Every turn revealed new patterns in the stones, lines repeating endlessly, labyrinthine formations that trapped him in a cycle he could not break. The whispers shifted tone, from insistent murmurs to a chorus of demands, overlapping with fragments of names, accusations, and secrets that seemed to have no origin beyond his own mind. His lantern flickered again, and for a brief second he caught sight of his reflection in a polished tombstone. Hollow eyes, gaunt face, a stranger staring back at him. Then the image vanished, swallowed by the fog. time fractured. Minutes became hours. Hours became nothing. The cemetery was endless, infinite in its loops and corridors. Every gravestone he passed seemed to twist slightly when he looked away, inscriptions changing, some familiar, others impossible, all calling to him with the same urgent insistence. He tried to retrace his steps, but the paths themselves had no memory of him, folding and curving like liquid stone. The whispers had grown into a cacophony of countless voices, overlapping and layering in ways that assaulted his perception. He realized, with a deep, sick certainty, that he would never leave. The fog thickened to a solid white, obscuring everything but the immediate row of gravestones around him. Shapes flickered within it, shadows leaning in, twisting, forming angles that should not exist. The whispers converged into a singular rhythm, pressing in on him from all sides, urging him forward toward the center, toward something he could neither see nor comprehend. The caretaker's lantern finally dimmed, sputtering, as if the night itself had claimed it, and he was left in darkness, the fog clinging to him like a second skin. And then, as the hours stretched and the chorus of whispers reached its peak, he understood what had happened. The cemetery had never been merely a resting place. It had been alive, patient, waiting for someone who could hear it, someone who could be drawn into its patterns, into its rhythm. He was not simply lost. He had been absorbed, consumed into its labyrinthine design. The stones, the fog, the voices, they were all part of it, and now he was part of them. When morning eventually came, if it ever did, the cemetery was silent. The fog had receded. The gravestones returned to their usual, familiar alignments. No trace of the caretaker remained. No footprints, no lantern, no sign of his presence. Only a faint, lingering echo hovered in the cold morning air, the memory of footsteps and whispers that would not be traced again. The cemetery waited in perfect stillness, its patterns intact, ready to ensnare the next visitor who wandered too far into its heart. The cycle of dread, the whispers of secrets and confessions, continued endlessly. A patient, silent horror that would never be understood or escaped. I had been drawn to Section 9 for weeks, pulled by the strange beauty of a cemetery that no one visited anymore. The graffiti on cracked tombstones and the streaked faces of statues had a quiet magnetism, a way of speaking to something I didn't yet understand. That evening, the sun had just slipped behind the skyline, leaving the valley in a muted wash of blues and grays. I parked my car at the edge of the cracked asphalt path and stepped onto the ground, feeling it sink slightly under my boots. The air was still, unnaturally still, like the world had paused and forgotten me. Setting down my camera bag, I began to move among the weathered stones, the lens picking up chipped engravings and lichen curling over dates that had long ceased to matter. A faint wind shifted, rustling dry leaves, but it carried no sound of life. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, then fell silent, leaving only the hollow whisper of the cemetery itself. I adjusted the lens, framing a leaning statue that seemed to watch me as if judging my intrusion. Shadows already pooled deep into the cracks of the tombs, stretching like long fingers across the cold ground. I took a few photos, the shutter clicking softly in the quiet, and noticed something almost imperceptible. A flicker at the corner of the frame, like movement that didn't belong. I lowered the camera and scanned the grounds, but no one was there. The stones were empty, the pathways deserted, yet the movement had been real. Each time I refocused, the air seemed to thrum, a pulse that I couldn't name, a vibration that ran along the stone surfaces and into my bones. The glow hit my eye next. a faint amber light just beyond the edge of the mausoleum cluster. No lantern had been there moments before, at least none that I could see. I approached cautiously, boots crunching on gravel, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the dying sun or a reflection off one of the statue's cracked surfaces. The light shifted as I drew near, flickering in small, irregular patterns that almost seemed to beckon me closer. The shadows behind the gravestones stretched and trembled, though there was nothing to cast them. The air carried a subtle warmth around the glow, a sensation that felt oddly deliberate, like it had been placed there to draw me in. I crouched, camera ready, snapping a few more frames. The lens caught the edge of the mausoleum roof and the toppled gravestones beyond, but the glow didn't appear in every shot. Sometimes it disappeared completely, leaving only dark stone. Sometimes it lingered, faintly, as if it were watching itself in the reflection of the lens. I felt a flicker of unease, the first real indication that this place did not obey ordinary rules. The wind, so still before, now seemed to sigh against my cheeks, carrying a faint metallic scent, like the tang of old coins or rusted iron. My heartbeat accelerated, echoing in my ears, and I realized that the quiet had changed from empty to attentive. I stepped closer to the corner where the light glimmered, careful not to disturb the loose gravel. The glow pulsed faintly in response to my movement, almost as if it were aware I had noticed it. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, the kind that doesn't leave when you step into a jacket, the type that burrows into memory. The statues seemed to lean inward slightly, silhouettes bending in unnatural ways under the last of the twilight. Each step I took, the glow responded, flickering faster, inviting me toward the heart of decay that no visitor had set foot in for decades. By the time I reached the edge of the mausoleum row, the light had settled in a small hollow, the source still unseen, the shadows around it trembling in strange rhythms. I lowered my camera, feeling the weight of the silence, a heaviness that made my chest tighten. Every instinct told me to retreat, to leave this place before whatever it was revealed itself. And yet, I found my feet moving forward, drawn to the lantern that shouldn't exist, toward the unknown that had begun watching me before I even arrived. The cemetery, abandoned, silent, and ancient, had already begun to claim me, and I did not know how far it would let me wander before it decided I belonged to its shadows. The glow had not disappeared when I returned my gaze to the corner of Section 9. It hovered there, faint and unsteady, as if aware I had lingered too long elsewhere. No one moved around it, no caretaker, no late-night wanderer, nothing that could explain its presence. The light didn't just illuminate the stone. It seemed to breathe against it, flickering in uneven, deliberate pulses that called me forward. Each flicker stretched the shadows, elongating them into strange, impossible shapes that seemed to lean just slightly toward me. I stepped closer, careful, my boots crunching against gravel that sounded far too loud in the stillness. The lantern's glow danced in time with some unspoken rhythm, like it knew exactly where I would step next. The air around it carried the faint scent of soot, or maybe something older, metallic, like the smell of wet iron left to decay. My camera lens trembled slightly in my hands, though my fingers were steady. Every click captured only fragments of the light. Sometimes it appeared larger, warmer, almost human. Sometimes it vanished entirely, leaving the shadows to claw at the edges of the mausoleum walls. As I circled the lantern, trying to see its source, I noticed the first odd distortions in my photographs. Figures appeared behind gravestones where nothing could possibly be standing, thin, shadowed shapes that bent and twisted in ways impossible for flesh and bone. The camera's screen flickered between real and unreal, making it hard to know if I had truly seen them or if the device itself had gone mad. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rising. The lantern seemed to respond to my attention, pulsing faster as I drew near, urging me toward the edge of the neglected mausoleum. I realized then that the cemetery had rules I did not understand. The tombs weren't fixed in place. Their positions felt subtly shifted when I looked away and then back again. Cracks in the stone seemed deeper, surfaces rougher, shadows stretching further than they should. I glanced at the mausoleum steps, the entrance yawning like a mouth, and the lantern bobbed slightly, beckoning, as though guiding me toward its center. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet every muscle in my body kept moving forward. A sudden gust of wind carried a sound I could not place, a soft scrape like fingernails over stone, echoing just behind the glow. I swung the camera, trying to catch it, but the lens only revealed the lantern and the empty hollow around it. The shadows, however, shifted, sliding across the ground in subtle loops, like they had their own will. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat, realizing that I had entered a space that was not only abandoned, but actively watching me. The lantern's light flickered again, forming small, deliberate arcs, almost gesturing. I stepped closer, following the pulses, and felt the ground slope beneath my boots. The earth here was uneven, broken by roots and rubble long forgotten. The air smelled faintly of decaying leaves and damp stone, and the closer I got, the more I felt the chill pressing into my bones, like fingers brushing across the spine. My breath came out in clouds, forming small white ghosts that dissolved instantly in the unnatural quiet. As I reached the base of the mausoleum steps, the shadows cast by the flickering lantern stretched along the walls, elongating, bending, as if they were alive. For a heartbeat, I could have sworn one of them stepped aside, giving me space to enter, though the stone remained unmoved. The glow pulsed again, steady and patient, drawing me in, compelling me forward with a force that was not physical but undeniable. My camera began to glitch, images overlapping, some showing the back of my own head in places I had not been. And then I realized the light wasn't just a lantern. It was an invitation, or perhaps a warning, a signal that the abandoned cemetery had noticed me, had singled me out, and that every shadow and every stone had conspired to lead me here. I inhaled sharply, gripping the camera tighter, and took a step up the first cracked stone. The lantern bobbed once, twice, and then flickered in a pattern I could almost read, as if saying, "Follow me, follow me, follow me." I did not know what I would find inside, only that I could not turn away. Something waited, something had been waiting, and the night had only just begun. The mausoleum steps were cold under my boots, slick with moss and the residue of decades of neglect. The lantern bobbed just ahead, its amber glow steady now, almost expectant. I moved closer, peering between the toppled stones and cracked slabs, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I noticed the flowers, fresh flowers, bright, unweathered, delicate petals spilling over graves that had not been touched in decades. I knelt briefly, reaching to touch them, but recoiled. The chill that radiated from the soil was unnatural, biting through my jacket. Something about the placement, the perfection of the arrangement, whispered that it had not been left by human hands. The cemetery, abandoned and silent, had become deliberate. It had a pattern. I raised my camera, trying to capture the odd juxtaposition of decay and life, and that's when the first anomalies appeared. In one frame, a thin figure crouched behind a gravestone, only to vanish when I looked up. In another, shadows that could not belong to any tombstone or statue twisted into shapes vaguely human. My camera seemed to double the world, folding it, bending it, showing spaces that weren't there. I took a step back, and a gravestone shifted slightly, not enough to notice at first, but enough to make my stomach knot. The air grew colder with each step I took, and the lantern's glow stretched outward, illuminating narrow corridors between the graves that had not existed moments before. Every direction seemed new, every turn unexpected. My breath came in quick puffs, leaving small clouds that dissipated into the heavy stillness. Somewhere beneath the mossy stones, the earth whispered, a soft, almost imperceptible hum vibrating beneath my feet. I told myself it was the wind, that it was fear, but every instinct screamed that the cemetery itself had awakened. I ventured deeper into the mausoleum area, the lantern bobbing in silent invitation. Every photograph I took betrayed me, capturing figures crouched, standing, or hovering just beyond reach. Sometimes they appeared transparent, like reflections, their shapes indistinct but undeniably watching. I tried to dismiss them as tricks of light or long exposure, but the consistency in the images, figures where none should exist, made rational explanations vanish. The layout of the graves seemed to shift subtly as I moved. A path that had been open a moment ago now narrowed. A cluster of tombstones that had been scattered now formed a jagged, deliberate pattern. The cemetery responded to my presence, rearranging itself, testing me, guiding me. I felt an almost sentient awareness pressing from the shadows, as if it were studying my reactions. Each flower-laden grave I passed seemed to murmur under my gaze, the soft rustle of petals like whispers brushing against the edges of sanity. The lantern pulsed again, and I noticed the first real dissonance in the ground beneath me. Small depressions, perfectly circular, appeared where I had not stepped, forming a trail toward a narrow, overgrown path deeper into the section. I crouched to examine one of the depressions. The soil was loose, fresh, and slightly warm, as if some unseen hand had just pressed into it. The thought of another presence, invisible yet deliberate, made my chest tighten. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along the mausoleum walls, reaching toward me as though they had grown impatient. The lantern bobbed slowly forward, its glow now rhythmically pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. Every instinct told me to retreat, but curiosity overpowered fear. I followed, step by step, aware of figures in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned fully, only to appear again elsewhere, closer. The camera's screen flickered with overlapping images, showing angles that didn't exist, corridors that defied the geometry of the cemetery. I paused at a cluster of graves, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The lantern lingered just beyond, casting shadows that formed shapes vaguely human, crouched and kneeling, watching. I shivered, gripping the camera as though it could protect me. Every step I had taken had been guided, manipulated, coaxed by a force that I could neither name nor confront. The cemetery had become alive in a way that was impossible, sentient in its silence, and I had become part of its unfolding ritual. As I stood frozen, the lantern pulsed once more, a soft, beckoning flicker that whispered without sound. I knew, without fully understanding, that the path ahead would not lead me out. It would lead me further in, into spaces that had no right to exist, into shadows that were patient and aware. And yet, some part of me could not stop moving. I was drawn forward, deeper into the heart of a cemetery that had awakened, deeper into its secrets, where the line between reality and something older, something unseen, had begun to dissolve. The lantern moved ahead of me now, no longer flickering like a playful light, but gliding with purpose, a steady glow against the encroaching darkness. The mausoleum walls faded behind me, the familiar rows of stones twisting into paths I had never seen before. Each step I took, the ground seemed to shift subtly beneath my boots, loose gravel and earth rearranging as if the cemetery itself were alive, guiding me forward. The chill had deepened, sharp enough to bite through my jacket, carrying the metallic tang of damp soil and something older, almost decayed. I followed the lantern down a narrow, overgrown pathway, over roots that twisted like veins through the soil. Shadows grew longer, stretching in impossible directions. Where I had expected dead ends or collapsed gravestones, there were now corridors lined with stone markers that seemed to lean toward me. Every marker was blank, worn smooth by time, or perhaps by some deliberate hand. The lantern pulsed faintly, casting an amber glow that shimmered along the moss-covered surfaces, beckoning me further. The deeper I moved, the more the air carried a whisper of sound, soft, unintelligible murmurs that curled through the narrow passage like wind weaving between stones. I paused, straining to make sense of them. The murmurs weren't coming from a single source. They seemed to circle me, shifting positions, rising and falling in volume without rhythm. I raised the camera, trying to record the scene, but the lens captured strange anomalies. Shadows that twisted independently, shapes hovering behind gravestones that had no right to exist. The layout of the cemetery now felt deliberately alien. Gravestones rotated slightly as I passed, clustering into odd geometric patterns, as if the dead themselves had arranged them. I stepped carefully. My every movement echoed in subtle tremors beneath the earth. Every photograph I took revealed more than I could see with my eyes. Ghostly figures kneeling, standing, or drifting just beyond the stones. Their outlines were translucent, bending with the lantern's glow, yet undeniably there. A cold gust carried the faintest scent of flowers, sweet and decayed at once, mingling with the sharp metallic tang in the air. The lantern's light pulsed again, quicker this time, and I realized it wasn't just floating ahead, it was responding to me, to my proximity, my hesitation. I could feel its intent, deliberate and patient, guiding me toward a central space I could not yet glimpse. The shadows around me stretched and leaned, subtle at first, then with unmistakable direction, pointing me onward. I felt the first real twinge of fear, as I noticed that the ground itself was uneven in ways that made no sense. Where I had stepped moments before was now a slight depression. The footprints I had left seemed distorted, pointing toward places I hadn't gone. The lantern pulsed softly again, urging me forward. A faint whisper rose above the murmurs. A single syllable, a sound that felt like a name I had forgotten but somehow knew. I shivered, gripping the camera tighter, realizing I was being led into spaces that did not exist on any map. The pathway narrowed further, the gravestones forming a tight corridor that pressed in around me. Shadows stretched along the stones, bending unnaturally, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw hands, pale and elongated, reaching toward the lantern as if guiding it. The air grew heavier, charged with anticipation, and my breath fogged in the cool night. I realized that even as I followed the light, I was no longer in control of my direction. The cemetery had taken the lead, and I was merely along for its patient, deliberate design. The lantern paused briefly, hovering above a small, open clearing surrounded by crooked gravestones. The shadows here converged, forming shapes that seemed to kneel and bow, silhouettes of figures caught mid-motion, their presence undeniable even if they had no substance. The whispers intensified, layering, overlapping, almost coherent, like a chorus of memories trapped in stone. I lifted the camera to my eye, but the viewfinder betrayed me. Ghostly figures appeared behind gravestones where none stood, bending the world into something impossible, yet utterly real. And then I understood the lantern was not leading me to a place. It was revealing it. The cemetery's forgotten heart had awakened, drawing me into the spaces between stone and shadow, into the corridors of its own design. Every instinct told me to turn back, but the path behind me no longer existed the way I remembered. The lantern pulsed again, steady and insistent, guiding me deeper into a darkness that was alive, purposeful, and patient. I had no choice but to follow, and then it was gone. The lantern, steady, deliberate, alive, vanished in a single heartbeat. One moment it hovered just ahead, pulsing softly, beckoning me forward. The next, the clearing was plunged into shadows so thick they seemed to drink the light from my camera's viewfinder. I froze, heart hammering, ears straining for anything, movement, breath, sound. But all that remained was the oppressive stillness of the cemetery. The murmurs, the whispers, the rustle of leaves had vanished along with it, leaving me alone in the dark. I tried to retrace my steps back along the narrow path that had guided me here, but the cemetery had shifted. Gravestones were no longer where they had been. Crooked rows had become jagged corridors. Paths I had not crossed twisted impossibly, leading me further into confusion. I called out once, my voice cracking in the chill night air, and only my own echo returned. Somewhere, just beyond the perimeter of vision, a shadow slid along a row of tombstones, fleeting and precise, vanishing when I blinked. Panic began to settle in, a weight pressing into my chest. The camera trembled in my hands as I tried to snap photographs, hoping to anchor reality, but each frame revealed the impossible. Transparent figures crouched behind stones, hovering just above the ground, or kneeling in silent reverence, or perhaps in warning. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped them. Their eyes, when glimpsed, were hollow and infinite. Every attempt to step back only drew me further into the cemetery's labyrinth, twisting its stones and paths as if I were being toyed with, studied. The ground beneath me shifted again, subtle depressions opening where my feet had not been, creating a disorienting maze. I stumbled, my breath coming in clouds that vanished almost instantly in the unnatural chill. Each step echoed with the faintest metallic scraping sound, a rhythm too deliberate to be accidental. The figures moved with it, sliding along the edges of my vision, gathering closer yet remaining just out of reach. They were mourners, or something like them, faceless, transparent, silently screaming, circling me without stopping. I tried to run, but the paths folded in on themselves. Graves that had been perpendicular now aligned diagonally, forming jagged corridors that funneled me deeper into confusion. I shouted, "Hello!" But the valley of stone returned only silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil, rotting petals, and faint smoke, a scent that clung to my clothes and hair. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching to meet me, blocking every route I could find. Every direction I turned led me back to the same point, a central clearing where the lantern had been, now empty, and yet somehow alive in memory. I stopped to catch my breath, camera clutched to my chest, eyes scanning the shapes of the gravestones, and then I saw them, figures materializing in the dark, translucent and unmoving, forming a ring around me. They raised their heads in unison, mouths open in silent screams, eyes endless pits reflecting every fear I had tried to suppress. I backed away, and the moment I moved, the path behind me twisted, rearranging itself. I realized there was no retreat. There was only forward, into the unknown geometry of this place that had no respect for time or space. I stumbled along a narrow passage, tripping over roots and broken stones, my hands scraping against moss and jagged edges. Each photograph I took revealed new horrors: mourners standing impossibly close, gravestones bending, the earth itself curling upward like it had life. The lantern's glow, now absent, haunted every frame, a faint shimmer lingering even in the void where it had vanished. It had not left. I could see it in the photographs. A pulse of amber light imprinted onto the stones, guiding and warning simultaneously. The whispering returned then, soft and overlapping, a chorus of voices that spoke no words, yet filled my mind with questions I did not want answered. I realized I was utterly lost, trapped in a cemetery that had transformed while I was watching, manipulated by a presence I could not name. Every attempt to retrace my steps pulled me further into the labyrinth. Every breath carried a sense of urgency, and every glance revealed that the mourners had multiplied, stretching into the periphery, always observing, always present. And still I pressed forward. Every instinct told me not to. Every rational thought screamed for retreat, but the cemetery had claimed its rhythm, and I had no choice but to follow. The first hints of dawn were barely brushing the horizon when I stumbled out of Section 9, lungs burning from the cold and heart hammering like it wanted to escape my chest. The cemetery's shadows retreated slowly, folding back into themselves as light spilled across cracked stones and toppled monuments. For a brief, fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I was free, or at least I thought I was. I collapsed against the edge of the iron fence, hands pressed to my face, trying to will my shaking limbs into stillness. The chill that had bitten so deeply during the night began to fade, replaced by the warmth of the rising sun. Birds began to stir, calling softly from distant trees, and the wind carried a familiar morning scent. Earth, grass, the hint of smoke from a nearby valley, but it all felt alien after what I had just endured. I glanced back once, and the cemetery appeared inert, abandoned once more, as if my terror had been conjured entirely in the darkness. I dared a look at the camera, hoping for proof that my eyes had betrayed me, that the photographs would show only empty stones and cracked mausoleums. But every image told the same story. Faces were etched into tombstones, eyes alive and fixated, staring directly at me. Some were faint, almost imperceptible, while others glared with a clarity that sent a chill down my spine. The amber glow of the lantern persisted in every frame, no longer moving, yet unmistakably present. It wasn't in the cemetery anymore. It was with me. I scrolled through the photos again, feeling the weight of unseen observation pressing into my chest. Every angle revealed more than I had noticed in the dark. Shadows lurked in corners that should have been empty, twisted and looped unnaturally. Figures crouched or knelt behind stones, translucent and frozen, yet somehow aware. I tried to delete the images, to erase what I had captured, but the files remained stubbornly intact, the lantern's glow bleeding through every exposure. It was proof that whatever had followed me would not release its hold so easily. The memory of the labyrinthine paths, the rearranged graves, and the silent mourners returned in vivid detail. I had thought I had escaped by reaching the sunrise, but the photographs proved otherwise. Section 9 had not let me go. It had only allowed me a brief reprieve, a chance to return to the world of ordinary light. The knowledge settled heavily. The cemetery's secrets were no longer confined within its walls. They had crossed the threshold with me. I drove away from the cemetery in a daze, the rising sun painting the valley in soft gold, but my thoughts were fixed on the images. Each photograph was a tether, a reminder that I had been marked. The faces in the stone seemed to watch the road ahead, following me even as the trees thinned and the city grew nearer. I tried to focus on the hum of the engine, the familiar lines of asphalt, but the lantern's glow and the eyes in the stones lingered, bleeding into every corner of my mind. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, sunlight flooded the streets, and the world appeared ordinary again. But the weight of the photographs refused to lift. Each image I scrolled through on my camera and phone reminded me that the cemetery's gaze had not been idle. It had taken notice of me, had catalogued me, and had left a mark I could neither see nor remove. The quiet of morning felt hollow, as if reality itself had been distorted during the night, and the knowledge that it could happen again pressed into me relentlessly. Later, when I tried to show the images to others, the lantern and the faces in the stones seemed to resist scrutiny. They could be dismissed as tricks of light, anomalies of exposure. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had followed willingly into the heart of Section 9. And somewhere, in the amber glow of every frame, I felt the presence, waiting, patient, observing, eternal. The photographs could not be deleted, the faces could not be ignored, and the lantern, quiet yet unrelenting, remained, silent proof that the secrets of the abandoned cemetery had followed me home, that the haunting was permanent, unresolved, and inescapable. The sexton's secret. I arrived just after noon, when the sun sat high enough to bleach the headstones into a dull, colorless glow. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, fenced in by rusted iron and tall pines that swayed without wind. It should have felt ordinary, just another historic site on my long list of places to document. But something about its silence pressed in from the moment I stepped through the gate. The gravel path crunched softly under my boots. Beyond it, the graves stretched outward in long, perfect rows. Not well-maintained, perfect, engineered, perfect. Each marker was spaced with such exact precision that, from certain angles, they looked like coordinates etched into the earth. Lines too straight, intervals too clean. As if the place wasn't grown over generations, but designed all at once by a hand that understood symmetry better than comfort. At first, I tried not to dwell on it. Old cemeteries often had rigid patterns. Families liked order. Town councils liked uniformity. There were reasons for this kind of arrangement, but the deeper I walked, the less those reasons held. Halfway down the main path, a cold draft slipped through the stillness and brushed the back of my neck. Not a breeze, not a shift in the air, just one brief, narrow current, like a breath exhaled by something passing behind me. The trees remained motionless. Even the tall grass didn't stir. Then came the sound. A faint scraping, metal on stone. Slow, steady, and deliberate. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. Nothing around me moved. I turned in a full circle, scanning the graves, the paths, the pine trunks leaning overhead. There was no caretaker in sight, no grounds crew, no maintenance truck. Just the rows, those two perfect rows, vanishing into distance in ruler straight lines. I pulled out the folded map given to me by the town clerk earlier that morning. A simple sketch of the cemetery's layout. But the longer I studied it, the more the details resisted lining up. The central path on the map branched into two narrow walkways at the midpoint, curving toward a cluster of family mausoleums. Yet, from where I stood, the paths curved differently, bending outward as if avoiding some invisible boundary. I paced a few yards forward, comparing map to terrain. No matter how I oriented the paper, the layout refused to match. Angles were wrong. Distances skewed. A few small family plots appeared where the map showed open grass. Others, listed clearly in ink, didn't seem to exist at all. It unnerved me more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent years cataloging graveyards, and they were never precise, but they were never shifting either. Another cold draft slipped between the rows, stronger this time, enough to make the back of my coat flutter. The scraping sound followed again, closer now, like stone sliding against stone. I forced myself to keep walking, letting logic override the unease. Old places made noises. Ground settled. A distant gate might have moved in the wind. That's what I told myself, at least. I reached the fork where the map insisted 2 side paths curved around a cluster of mausoleums. The structures loomed ahead, weathered stone buildings with peaked roofs, some sealed with iron gates, others with thick marble slabs. They were beautiful in a somber way, carved with dates and names from families that had died out long before electricity ever reached this town. Even from a distance, one of them drew my eye. A narrow brick mausoleum tucked slightly apart from the others. Ivy curled up one corner. The stone arch above the entryway bore a family name I didn't recognize, and unlike the rest, which had heavy doors or wrought iron gates locked tight, this one had a single stone door sitting half open, just a few inches. Just enough to suggest someone had gone in or come out. I waited, listening for movement inside. Nothing. But the silence had changed. It felt weighted, as if the air held its breath. I looked around again, checking for any sign of life. No cars parked by the outer fence, no tools left by landscapers, not even fresh footprints in the loose gravel. Nothing but my own. The scraping sound came once more, one slow drag, and then stopped abruptly, almost expectantly. I stepped closer to the mausoleum, each footfall muffled by the soft soil beneath the gravel. The door's narrow gap revealed only darkness. No draft seeped through. No smell of damp stone or decay. Just a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. I touched the edge of the stone door lightly with my fingertips. It felt colder than anything else in the cemetery. Not cool from shade. Cold like winter glass. A thin line of frost stretched across its inner corner, though the rest of the structure stood warm in the afternoon light. I drew my hand back, suddenly aware of how quiet the grounds had become. Even the distant crows that had circled earlier were gone. A thought whispered through me. Unwelcome, irrational, but persistent. This door wasn't open a moment ago, yet I had no memory of when I first noticed it. It was simply open, as though it had been waiting. Another cold breath of air passed behind me, brushing my collar. I turned sharply, heart thudding. No one was there, just the endless rows, so perfect, so still, that seemed to watch me from every angle. When I faced the mausoleum again, the door had slipped open another inch. Not wide, just enough to prove it hadn't been the wind. I stood frozen, map crinkling in my hand. Whatever lived in this cemetery, whatever shaped its perfect rows and warped its pathways, had just given me my first invitation, and I didn't yet know if stepping closer would uncover a forgotten piece of history, or let that history reach out for me. I spent the next morning speaking with the locals, hoping to make sense of the mausoleum I'd found open the previous day, but every conversation circled back to a single, uneasy truth. No one alive had ever known a caretaker for that structure. The last sexton assigned to this cemetery had died generations ago, and no replacement had been appointed afterward, as if the town simply chose to let the dead tend themselves. With that in mind, I returned to the grounds before dusk, compelled by a mixture of duty and a growing, almost reluctant curiosity. The mausoleum door stood ajar again, exactly as I'd left it, or exactly as someone or something had arranged it. When I stepped inside, I expected dust, cobwebs, the stagnant cold of abandonment, but the interior felt strangely preserved. The stone floor was clean, completely free of debris, and the air held a faint mineral chill, as though the walls exhaled from some hidden chamber. A long stone bench ran along the back wall, smoothed by touch, but untouched by time. No footprints, no weathering, no signs of animals. Only a single stack of journals, their covers brittle at the edges but arranged too neatly to have sat unattended for a century. I opened the first one with the hesitation of someone disturbing a sleeping thing. The handwriting inside was tight, disciplined, the entries recording nightly tasks with a precision bordering on ritual, sweeping paths, aligning lanterns, noting the behavior of crows and the times footsteps were heard in the western rows. Some entries ended normally. Others cut off mid-sentence, ink trailing like a breath caught in the writer's throat. As I read, a faint vibration hummed through the bench, subtle enough that I might have blamed my imagination, yet strong enough to make the edges of the pages tremble. I set the journal down, suddenly aware of the growing darkness outside, the sunlight draining from the doorway like water slipping down a drain. I stepped out, grateful for open air, but the moment my boot touched the threshold, a soft movement stirred behind me. The stone door, heavy, solid, resistant to even a firm push, swung open just a little farther without a sound, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I froze there on the steps, watching the widening crack as the cemetery around me fell into a hush so complete it felt manufactured. The pines had gone still again. The last light of day stretched long shadows across the perfect rows, and behind me the door remained open, not swinging back into place or drifting shut as a loose hinge might, but waiting, almost inviting, the journals inside lying as orderly as if the sexton himself had placed them there that very morning. I stepped back, pulse quickening, unable to shake the sense that the mausoleum wasn't simply abandoned. It was being kept, tended to by a caretaker no one claimed to know, who had left the door open not by accident, but to make certain I would return. And in the lingering silence, I began to suspect that I already had. By the time I returned to the cemetery that evening, the sky had already sunk into a dull violet, the kind of color that made the gravestones look like silhouettes carved out of a deeper shadow. I carried one of the sexton's journals with me, intending only to skim a few more entries before heading back to the inn, but the stillness of the place tugged at my senses the moment I stepped inside the gates. The air felt heavier than it had the night before, as if the cemetery had drawn tighter around itself while waiting for me. I walked toward the western row, the section most frequently mentioned in the sexton's notes, and found a spot near an old willow tree where the path widened just enough to sit and read. The words on the page described soft, dragging footsteps that the sexton heard every night at the exact same hour. Footsteps he insisted did not belong to any person he had ever seen. As I traced the lines with my finger, a thin current of cold air crept across the ground, brushing my ankles like something crawling past. I tried to focus on the journal, but the atmosphere had grown strangely hollow, as though each breath I took echoed faintly somewhere behind the mausoleums. Then, somewhere beyond the willow's drooping branches, gravel shifted. It was subtle at first, a single crunch, a solitary drag, then another, spaced evenly apart, forming a slow, rhythmic pattern. I froze, listening harder, and the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, matching the cadence recorded in the very entry I was reading. They weren't hurried or erratic. They sounded patient, purposeful, the stride of someone who knew the paths well enough to walk them in the dark. I stood slowly, scanning the row for a lantern or any sign of a person, but the graves were swallowed in twilight, and the path beyond the tree was empty. The steps circled, fading left, then right, as if pacing along an invisible route. When I lifted the journal again, my breath caught. A fresh smear streaked across the page, dark, damp, and glistening faintly in the fading light. I hadn't touched the ink. No moisture had been on my hands. And the smear followed the exact angle of a finger dragging across the writing, pressing just hard enough to distort the words beneath it. My pulse hammered in my ears as the footsteps slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving a silence so abrupt it felt like the cemetery itself was holding its breath. I closed the journal, but the sensation of that unseen trace remained, as if the pages still remembered the pressure. Across the western row, a row of headstones seemed slightly turned toward me, aligned in a way they hadn't been earlier. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by presence, by attention, as if the one who had dragged those footsteps for generations had paused just long enough to mark the page in my hands. The air thickened, the shadows leaned, and the journal felt suddenly heavier, as though it now carried something more than notes of the dead. I backed away slowly, but I had the unmistakable sense that I was no longer just reading the sexton's account. I was becoming part of it. The next night I returned with more hesitation than certainty, carrying 2 of the sexton's journals under my arm, and telling myself I needed only a few more details before moving on to the next site. But the cemetery felt different the moment I stepped inside. Denser somehow, as if the air had been packed tighter between the gravestones. I made my way toward the mausoleum cluster, intent on cross-referencing a handful of names. But as I knelt beside a worn granite marker, the quiet around me thinned into something fragile and stretched, like the world was listening in on my breath. I opened the older journal first, flipping through pages where the sexton had scrawled notes about families long buried, and began reciting the names in my head to match them with the cemetery's layout, when a soft whisper drifted from behind the nearest mausoleum. My own words, repeated back to me, perfectly mirrored, as though spoken through a thin layer of water. I froze, thinking it must have been wind slipping through the stone vents, but the night was still, and the whisper continued, faint yet unmistakable, whispering lines from my research notes I hadn't spoken aloud since arriving in town. I rose slowly, scanning the shadows between the mausoleums, and saw movement where no light touched. Dark shapes gliding along stone walls with a smoothness that felt more like drifting than walking, their forms bending around the edges of the structures as though they weren't bound by angles at all. The journal in my hand trembled slightly, or maybe it was my grip, but when I looked down at the open page, I noticed something the sexton had written in the margin. A list of 4 names, neatly inked, each followed by the same date. 3 were families buried here. The 4th was someone still alive, someone whose death record I hadn't filed yet, though it was on my desk back at the inn, half completed from a recent archive request. My stomach tightened as I realized the sexton had recorded it long before I ever read it. The whispering grew clearer, closer, weaving through the graves as though circling me, repeating fragments of the names I held in my hands. I shut the journal, trying to steady my breathing, but the shadows continued gliding, closing their distance in slow, deliberate swells. Then, from directly behind me, a voice whispered so close to my ear that the warmth of it brushed my skin. "Why did you come back tonight?" I turned instantly, heart slamming against my ribs, but the path was empty, the mausoleum silent, the nearest headstones staring upward in their perfect, orderly rows. The whisper lingered in the air a moment longer, fading like breath on a mirror, leaving me with the chilling realization that something in the cemetery not only knew my voice, it knew my intentions. And in the thickening silence that followed, I understood the journals weren't just records of the past. They were warnings that had begun reading me in return, I shouldn't have returned after midnight. I knew that even as I stepped through the cemetery gate, but something about the journals had begun gnawing at my thoughts, a tugging insistence that there was one more detail I needed to understand before I could leave this place behind. The air felt colder than on any previous night, a sharp, metallic cold that settled in my chest with each breath. And as I made my way along the looping pathways, the familiar landmarks looked subtly wrong, as though the cemetery had been rearranged while the town slept. Headstones I had passed dozens of times were angled differently, tilting inward like watchers leaning over a balcony. A narrow family plot that used to sit near a willow tree was now pressed against the far boundary fence, its markers aligned in a spiral that hadn't existed on any map or memory. The deeper I walked, the more the pathways began to curve in on themselves, turning straight routes into quiet labyrinths, the kind that seemed to pulse when I wasn't looking. Some graves appeared younger too, fresh soil still soft, the edges damp as if turned only hours ago. Yet the dates etched into their stones stretched back decades, impossible to reconcile with the newness of the earth beneath them. I pulled out the sexton's next journal, hoping his notes might offer some explanation, and flipped to the marked page. The entry spoke of nights when the cemetery stretched to make room, describing how graves would shift, paths would realign, and the land itself would adjust like a sleeping creature rolling in its bed. As I read, a slow throb moved beneath the ground, subtle but unmistakable, and a ripple traveled through the grass like something passing underneath. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I turned in a tight circle, trying to orient myself, but every row around me seemed slightly different than it had moments before. I set my boot in a patch of soft soil, only to freeze. There, pressed clearly into the dirt, was the imprint of my own footprint, facing inward toward the deeper paths. I hadn't walked that way. I was certain of it. Yet a trail of identical prints stretched ahead, each one perfectly aligned, as though I had passed through moments earlier without remembering. A pulse of cold air moved along the trail, brushing past me like a draft from an open doorway. I followed the prints with my eyes, watching them snake deeper into the cemetery, where the shadows thickened into something almost tangible. A faint sound traveled through the maze of graves, a distant scrape, followed by a low shift of stone rubbing against stone, and the headstones seemed to lean a little, closer with every heartbeat. I closed the journal, but the words inside clung to my thoughts, warning me that the cemetery was not merely a place of rest, it was a living structure, expanding by choice, adaptable, responsive, and aware of every step I took within it. And standing there in the rearranged pathways, surrounded by graves that had moved to make room, I felt the ground settle beneath my feet, in a way that made me wonder if it had already chosen a place for me too. I returned to the mausoleum just before dawn, driven less by curiosity now and more by a tightening sense that something within those stone walls had begun anticipating me, tracking me with the same precision the sexton once used in his nightly logs. I carried the final journal under my arm, its leather cover furred with age yet strangely warm against my palm, as though it had been handled moments before I found it. When I opened it inside the mausoleum, the breath left my lungs. The very first entry described me in chilling detail. The clothes I had worn on my first day in town, the way I paused at the gate before entering, even the slight catch in my breath when I first touched the mausoleum's cold door. The ink looked fresh, glistening in the dim light seeping through the cracks in the stone, each stroke sharp and deliberate, as if the writer had finished just minutes before I arrived. My pulse quickened as I scanned ahead, but the words tightened into something more personal, describing the pages I had read in the previous journals, the times I had visited, the precise path I walked last night as the graves shifted under moonlight. I stepped back toward the doorway, needing air, needing distance, but the moment I crossed into the threshold, the cemetery outside was no longer familiar. The paths had rearranged themselves into narrow corridors that funneled inward, their turns sharp and claustrophobic, steering me back toward the mausoleum no matter where I looked. Headstones stood at angles that hadn't existed an hour earlier, their carved faces turned toward me like patient observers. A heavy quiet fell over everything, thick and charged, and that was when I heard it, slow, measured breathing, seeping through the sealed stone wall behind me. Not an echo, not wind, but the controlled exhale of someone standing just inches away on the other side, steady and unhurried, as if they had been waiting for me to come alone. I stepped back inside, unsure which direction offered safety, but the breathing continued, rhythmic and confident, keeping pace with my racing heart. The journal in my hand felt heavier now, the pages swelling slightly as if something inside them was waking. I glanced down, and the ink began to spread across the next blank page, writing itself in thin, deliberate strokes, forming the beginning of a new entry. My name, the time, the date, the mausoleum of the Western Row. The breath behind the wall deepened, steady as a metronome. The stone beneath my feet vibrated faintly, as though something on the other side was shifting forward. I backed toward the exit, but the door didn't offer escape anymore. It felt more like the open mouth of a corridor that led only deeper. The journal continued writing, the ink thickening, curling into words I couldn't bring myself to read. The breathing paused for a single, awful moment, then resumed, closer than before. And in that narrowing silence, I realized the entry being written wasn't about what had happened. It was about what was about to. I left the mausoleum at a near run, desperate to put distance between myself and the steady breathing behind the wall. But the cemetery resisted me with a quiet, deliberate certainty, turning every path I took into a slow curve that led straight back to the same stone threshold. No matter how I angled my steps, left around the willow, right past the family plots, deeper toward the northern fence, I would emerge again in front of that open doorway, as if the entire grounds had folded themselves into a maze whose end point was always the same. The mausoleum stood wider each time I returned, the stone door yawning like a dark throat, the shadows inside trembling even though no breeze touched the cemetery. I tried to ignore the growing weight in the air, but then the footsteps began. Soft at first, scattered across the gravel like fleeting echoes, then multiplying, spreading through the rows in slow, patient rhythms that circled me from every side. They weren't chaotic, they weren't hurried. They closed in with the measured confidence of something that understood the land better than I ever could. The journals in my pack rustled, pages fluttering furiously as if caught in a draft, though not a single leaf moved on the trees overhead. I dropped to my knees beside a gravestone to catch my breath, but even the headstone seemed angled toward me now, as though observing my failure to escape. A sudden gust, cold, sharp, unnatural, burst from the direction of the mausoleum, flipping one of the journals open on the ground. Its blank pages rippled forward until they settled on a spread of untouched parchment, waiting, expectant. The footsteps drew closer, converging on the path in front of me with the steady inevitability of a closing hand. I crawled backward, but a jagged shadow slid across the gravel ahead, thin, elongated, and unmistakably shaped like an arm stretching toward me. The doorway behind it pulsed with darkness, swallowing even the faint pre-dawn light. The shadow's finger extended, not with sudden violence but with slow certainty, pointing me toward the open tomb as if this part of the cemetery's history had been rehearsed long before I arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat loud enough to throb in my ears. But the paths around me had already shrunk. Fences and graves pressed inward in the corner of my vision, hurting me with silent choreography. The journal's pages flapped. Again, louder now, like wings beating in a narrow room, and the page on the ground began to fill, not with handwriting this time, but with faint indentations, as though invisible fingers pressed down. I rose shakily to my feet, every instinct screaming to turn and run. Yet my legs carried me closer to the mausoleum's darkened entrance, drawn by a pull I couldn't explain. The footsteps halted all at once, plunging the cemetery into a suffocating, anticipatory stillness. The shadow didn't move. It only pointed. And as I reached the threshold, the air seemed to tilt around me, the world narrowing until there was nothing left but that open door and the quiet certainty that I was being guided somewhere I could no longer refuse. I don't remember stepping into the mausoleum. I only remember the cold swallowing the edges of my vision and the weightless moment when the world outside seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but darkness and the faint scratch of something writing nearby. When I finally woke, or thought I woke, the air felt heavy with dust and time, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. My journals were gone, pulled from my pack, sorted, arranged, yet I couldn't see who had moved them. A pale light seeped under the door, the kind of light that belongs to early morning, and as I crawled toward it, my hands brushed crumpled pages scattered across the floor. They were mine. My notes, my sketches, my observations, all laid out with a meticulousness that mirrored the sexton's earliest entries. The moment I pushed the door open, the cold air outside struck me hard enough to make my breath stagger. But when I stepped out, the cemetery was empty of sound, stripped of the footsteps and whispers that had stalked me for days. The mausoleum door behind me creaked softly, easing open with a familiarity that felt almost mocking. I staggered forward, disoriented, until I heard distant voices drifting in from beyond the gates, townsfolk murmuring to each other in low, uneasy tones. I followed the sound, moving between the rows that now stood perfectly aligned again, all disorder erased, as though the cemetery had reset itself overnight. When I reached the outer path, I saw two locals standing near the entrance, staring into the cemetery with troubled expressions. They didn't see me, or maybe they couldn't. One pointed toward the mausoleum, muttering that someone must have visited during the night because a stranger's notes had been found laid out neatly on the stone bench inside. My chest tightened as I reached instinctively for my pack, but it hung weightless on my shoulder. Empty, completely empty. I turned back toward the mausoleum, and the cold that rolled from its doorway made the hair on my arms rise. Something tugged at my memory, pages flipping, ink spreading, the soft exhale of breath behind a wall, and with a sickening certainty, I realized the journals inside no longer belonged solely to the sexton. A new entry had been added. Mine. Written in the same measured strokes, describing the visitor who stayed, the one who had walked the shifting paths and stepped willingly into the darkness when the cemetery called. I stepped closer, almost without meaning to, and the ground beneath me seemed to hum in quiet recognition. The townsfolk's voices faded behind me, replaced by the low, familiar scrape of stone shifting somewhere deep within the cemetery's core. The mausoleum door creaked wider, inviting, expectant. And just before the world dimmed around me, I saw one last thing. A fresh row of graves near the western path, perfectly aligned, waiting in immaculate symmetry, as though the cemetery already knew exactly where I belonged.